everyone, and welcome. My name is Whitney Baywall. I am the Director of Partnerships here at Cedar. First and foremost, I want to take a moment to acknowledge our audience today. What an impressive turnout. We are thrilled to see such high attendance for this session. Today's event will last about 45 minutes, and we will be taking questions, so please feel free to chime in on the Hop-In Stage chat thread that's located on the right-hand side of your screen. We would love to hear from you and have a really engaging discussion this afternoon. Now I'd like to take a minute and introduce our participants. Leading the discussion today is Cedar's president, Seth Cohen. And our panelists today are Sheila Augustine, Director of Revenue Cycle at Nebraska Medicine; Christine Hayek, Assistant Vice President, Digital Experience and Innovation at AtlantiCare; Zakiya Devine, Senior Director of Patient Financial Clearance at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia; and John Freeman, President and CEO at Revigate. Lastly, I do encourage you all to sign up for our mailing list. You can find it on the Cedar website under the events page. We have some really exciting talks coming up this year that we would love for you to join. So thanks everyone for being with us this afternoon. I will hand things off to Seth to begin our discussion.
Thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you to our amazing panelists for doing this with us. I know this is a hot topic, as Whitney said, and we're really, really grateful for this amazing turnout. So there's a lot to talk about here in limited time. I really encourage questions or comments in the chat. We will do our best to address as many of them as we can, and I'll keep my eye on it so that if folks have questions as we go, we'll try to answer some as we go, and we'll definitely reserve time at the end. So with that, we're going to start with a little bit of an icebreaker question. And Sheila, we'll start with you. If there is one word to describe how you feel about the No Surprises Act, what would that one word be?
If I have to limit it to one word, I was really thinking through that, Seth. Confusion.
Okay, Christine.
Yeah, I kind of look at it from a different lens. I look at it as very patient-centric, a lot of what healthcare is already doing and a lot of the legislation.
Okay, patient-centric. Zakiya.
Intense.
It's a good one. And John.
So like Sheila and Zakiya, my mind goes about how to operationalize this, and I would say arduous.
Arduous. Okay. I think there's some similarities coming out through there. So let's dig into more of the content, though. I think a lot of folks are really struggling to think through how to best prepare for this legislation and the implications of it. And so maybe tell us a little bit about how you have each prepared. What lessons did you learn along the way, and what, especially the ways that could help for future legislation? So maybe, Zakiya, we'll start with you. And then, John, when we come to you, you can certainly share how you've helped inform client work in this.
So I would say we really were building on some momentum of getting closer and closer to more proactive patient price transparency and communicating with families to really establish their financial experience. So it was really catapulted and moved into like fifth gear. A lot of work that was slowly maturing and evolving, and really just said time to do it. And so ripped off the Band-Aid on something we were tipping our toe in the water and really had to jump in. So it really allowed us to optimize tools and systems we had, and really required that we build a bit more capacity to support them in a very specific and intentional way. Across from the moment you schedule all the way through the moment you're here. So it really just stitched together everyone's role in the experience much more, and made it very, very clear kind of what it is and how to do it. So it was a building.
So it sounds like a lot already in flight that you then just chose to really prioritize and focus on. Mm-hmm. Christine or Sheila, how would you respond to that?
Sure. So if I ask my revenue cycle team, I think they felt a little bit underprepared for when this came out. They were really focused on COVID and the price transparency work from that side, along with the fact that we had just converted over to a brand new physician billing company. So there was a lot going on already for this to come out. So it was a little bit overwhelming for them as a team. But from the perspective and the work that we've been trying to accomplish around our digital front door and really creating those consumer all-in access frictionless experiences, we had already been talking about how do we create that experience for our patients to create better patient experiences. So similar, it really allowed us to get this to the top of the priorities and start talking about how do we create more automation and self-service, and really kind of made it mandatory that we get there around that. So we're working hard to kind of figure some of those things out and how to do that.
That's right.
So to piggyback off Christine, being in the revenue cycle, I did feel a little bit unprepared. I would say the first thing that we were all hoping for was it would get pushed off another year. I think that was in the back of all of our minds, just hoping beyond hope that it would get pushed off. It was something that we did engage front end and back end of the revenue cycle. We are on Epic for our electronic health record. We engaged our IT area as well as resources from Epic, and we utilized a different meeting that we had once a week, and we formed that to be part of the No Surprise Act so that we could continue to follow up on issues while we were testing. And toward the end, I think we felt that we were in a very, very good spot and probably ahead of some of our peers in just a lot of the work that we were already doing.
Got it. Any thoughts on why that might be? What put you in such a strong position?
You're just stealing my glory for later on, but
okay.
A little bit. No, that's okay. A little bit. We were testing a lot of our estimates and trying to get more estimates out to the patients. But we were going at it at a slow manner, testing in a specific service line first and making sure we all felt comfortable and then moving to the next one. And so I felt that helped. Actually, that was the meeting that we took over, was our weekly estimates meeting, and made it part of the No Surprise Act. So I think that did help us to get us in a better place.
Makes sense. Thank you. John, anything you would add in working with your clients?
Yes, I would say what I've seen work well is for health systems to not approach this in a revenue cycle silo, but really open up a cross-functional team that's inclusive of your IT and technological vendor partners, your compliance and your risk and legal functions within the organization, because this legislation is a bear. It's complex. It's 700 plus pages. There is a lot of ambiguity and things that are gray areas, if you will, and left up to interpretation. So everyone within your organization has to ensure they're on the same page with their level of risk tolerance and their interpretation of the legislation. And I feel like those organizations who were well along with their compliance in the price transparency space had a leg up on being prepared, particularly those that were able to invest in technological solutions to help with automated estimates and things of that nature.
That's great. Really helpful. Many of you mentioned the price transparency component of the No Surprises Act, and that brings my thoughts to the consumers who are meant to benefit from it. And so I'm curious, in your communities, are patients aware of the No Surprises Act? And in what ways are you educating them about the legislation? So maybe this time we'll start with you, Christine.
Yeah, I don't think that most of our patients are aware. Obviously, there's always a subset that stay close to this. But I don't think a lot of them are really aware of what this change was. It kind of crept in there. And I think, what we've been trying to do is take a look at the resources that are available. CMS has a lot of good resources on their website, and get out there and identify those touch points in our workflow processes where we have those opportunities to make sure that we communicate with our patients. Moving forward, we have opportunities from a digital perspective of creating those touch points when patients are wayfinding, and really getting that information out in front of them. So really just looking at where we have opportunities to deliver that information, and then in what ways we can best communicate that information to them.
And is there a particular channel that you're finding to be more effective in getting that information?
So we're still as I mentioned, we're still in a lot of building processes. But I think that the first opportunities are in new patient packets and delivering some of those opportunities. When we're doing the price estimations, we're still working to build out some of the digital pieces of that work. So when folks are going and looking, we'll have automated tools in place so that they can get those good faith estimates right from the patient portal as we continue to build it out. Trying to drive folks into one central place where they get all the information that they need about their healthcare experiences, kind of funneled into one place. So that's really where we're headed right now. We still have a lot of manual processes in place as we continue to build out our all-in access portal.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Sheila, what are you finding with your consumers?
So I would agree with Christine. I do not feel that the bulk of our patients in the community knew about the No Surprise Act. I think we had to take an approach as well to educate our end user staff, especially our access services, who would be handing, the patient the information about the No Surprises Act. And that is probably one area that we were not the best equipped, that we didn't get our staff really educated to explain it, because I can go sit down and access and hear them now probably explain it better. But initially in the beginning, here's a flyer, please read it, and give the high level. We, again, are on Epic, so we do try to push as much as we can to the MyChart portal or OneChart portal, and try to leverage our website, as well as what Christine said with our new patient packets, when we have new patients maybe coming into certain service lines and adding more additional information. But it really is about educating the patients so that they understand the questions that they really want to ask, and have knowledge of the answers, and really, I should say, probably understand the answers more now than they historically had in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point on the access team. Zakiya, what's your thought?
Yeah, I think I'm not so sure that we're more of a push, right? I think this regulation has forced us all to push more information out, not so much pull from patients and families. And I think, and our approach was really to layer this into the experience, so it's just part of it, right? So it's integrated into what happens when you schedule and what happens when you check in. It's not in addition to or separate. So it is just ingrained in how we show up and tell you what to expect from us as a provider, right? So I think we've been working really hard around what is our financial experience. And we had the price transparency tool from 2 years ago now. So all of us have had to adjust to that transparency, and there's just layering it on. And so across from the beginning to the end, families just have this as part of their experience. We certainly are able to leverage our MyChop as in terms of layering all of the notices and disclosures and the estimates, and kind of it's part of the muscle we started and really had to build out pretty quickly across every service. So families are told a lot more. I think they're not 100% sure is this going to change it for me? And those who know it will change, get an estimate and understand what that estimate means to them, because that had been explained. So it's just a part of the experience now, and not something in addition to or to be asked for in a different way. So that's how we've approached it.
John, I'll go to you once again just to round out if you have any thoughts or comments on the communities that you're seeing with your clients.
Yes, and as you all know, Seth, probably better than anyone, the landscape of explaining healthcare reimbursement and patient liability in our current ecosystem is very difficult. And as you're hearing from everyone here, it's even for us professionals who deal with this every day, wrapping our head around certain scenarios as to whether or not patients are protected in a given scenario, or how should a balance be handled. I think in general, it's confusing for patients and potentially a little misleading, especially when you think about the title, right? No Surprises Act. I've seen instances in which patients are just, I'm surprised that I didn't know this bill was coming. It could be for my deductible and totally legitimate, but
Right.
it surprised me and therefore I shouldn't have to pay for it. So I think, as everyone mentioned here, trying to increase awareness and educate more on the front end, but that's difficult because you only have a limited amount of time for throughput, and there are various other things that need to be addressed and signed. But obviously, I think scripting on the back end and doing as much education through the customer service component is key as well. And just within your own organization, being able to have a consistent scripting and messaging to, once again, educate the patient and the consumer would be beneficial.
Right.
Yeah, and John, I think it's interesting that you say that. I was a benefits director for our own healthcare system for years. And I think one of the things missing from this legislation really was around the insurers and their responsibility in this and notifications and how they could help support this. Leaving it all to the hospitals. A lot of people are looking at those coordination of benefit documents and seeing those bills. Why isn't the responsibility on the insurer to also communicate some of those messages around that as well?
Christine, you're not the first that I've heard to express that sentiment,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I do think there are elements of the legislation that were more payer focused, like advanced EOBs, that have gotten pushed out. And so hopefully we'll see some of that reciprocity. We'll see, in due time. There was a quick question in the chat that I thought we could quickly surface. And maybe, John, I'll actually turn it to you as our resident expert here. The understanding from one of the folks attending is that this legislation only applies to out-of-network emergency services. Is that correct? And maybe it would be helpful to distinguish what is specific to out-of-network emergency versus more broadly.
Yeah, no, it's much more broad than that. One of the major scenarios that the legislation looked to address were protections for emergency services, so you couldn't be balance billed. But kind of another facet that the legislation aimed to close was a negative experience when you're visiting an in-network hospital or facility and you have out-of-network providers participating in your care. For instance, anesthesia was a common example in that scenario where, as a patient and consumer, I've done my due diligence. I'm going to have my procedure at a hospital that's in network. I had no control over Dr. Smith participating in my case and being balance billed in that scenario. So that was kind of one of the main cruxes, which I think we could all agree is a good thing, that affords patients greater protections in that space.
Yeah, I think the emergency and the out-of-network balance billing got a lot of attention in the news, but the legislation certainly went well beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
Sheila, you mentioned one example of the pain points around access or communicating and coaching your teams that are talking to patients regularly. And that kind of reminded me of a question I wanted to pose to the group, and we can start again with you, Sheila. What has been the biggest pain point in rolling out, the implementation of this legislation?
I would probably say a pain point, and it still remains a pain point, is our estimates and giving them out. And like I said earlier, that we really started slow when we started rolling out estimates. And so with this regulation, and John probably has much better wording than I, you do have to give your self-pay patients an estimate within so long of their scheduled appointment. Well, we chose to just continue on with our estimates for all patients, so insured and self-pay. But what we continue to have problems with are the not as easy ones. So when we started estimates, we did radiology. Well, now we're talking about procedures. And it is very hard to get an accurate estimate when you're looking at historical data And if you have one case that was an anomaly, that can throw the estimate very different from what you were expecting. And, unfortunately, we can say that there was some great things that came from the No Surprise Act, and then there was other things that caused a lot of confusion as well. We have had patients who have canceled appointments because they got an estimate, but the estimate was wrong on our end. And so we had to go back and fix that. So it continues to be a pain point, but it is, from a patient perspective, it is really nice to know that you're getting an accurate estimate up front before you have services, but it's only as good as what we know.
That's great. Others want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's that, which disclaimer, there's a disclaimer in all the good faith estimates about anticipated and unanticipated services. And the question is, how much do we know, right? We're all trying to figure out, did I really know? Did I anticipate enough? Did I pick the right patients? In Epic's tool, you can really figure out how to balance all of them. So I think we're all in this, how accurate can I get this? Relative to what's expected in this regulation and the reality of healthcare, you come in and present one way versus what it was when you scheduled. And so I think we're really trying to balance how to give a precise version of what is assuming we have a crystal ball. And even though we're doing our best, it is really going to be a challenge in that unanticipated space that can be non-covered and necessary. Which makes you need an estimate, can be a tough space for us all to respond to and get those estimates out quickly and timely. So I think that's we are also, while we're comfortable in our estimate space and building that out and going faster, that is the dance every day of how precise and comprehensive can you be for every patient.
And Christine, not sure your perspective on this, but I think one way to think about it is it's not just giving an estimate or trying to be as precise as you can with the estimate, but how do you communicate to a patient how to think about that estimate? Because you're used to receiving an estimate for something and then you immediately attach a certainty to it, right? But of course, in healthcare, there's a lot of context that goes behind understanding, and that communication can be challenging.
Yeah, I think so. And I think those are the challenges that we're trying to solve overall. When you look at what consumer expectation is of an experience ever since Amazon and Google and all of these convenient services came out, our consumers are expecting the same thing from healthcare, and we're just not there yet. I mean, all of us are working towards how do we create those experiences. But when you go to Amazon, there's a price, and then it tells you, what other prices are available, similar products available at other locations, and creating those things. And I don't think healthcare is really 100% there yet. We haven't figured out, and some of the legislation that comes out, I think, comes from that context of, well, this is what a consumable is supposed to do these days, right? But thinking about how do we connect the dots, and one of our pain points are the providers that come into our hospital have been loyal providers that haven't wanted to contract with the big payers because their rates get cut. And now we're trying to figure out how to coordinate those estimates with them. The good news is that anesthesiology and emergency services, we've done a good job of kind of closing the door on those too, and having, those contracted providers have to participate in the insurances that we have at the hospital. But some other areas like plastics and trauma, trying to figure out what that balance bill might look like and coordinating with them in places that we haven't had to do yet. So not only from a patient perspective, but how do we as a healthcare system start to organize data and communicate and coordinate care differently than we have in the past, and what might have to change with our credentialing team when they're credentialing new providers.
That's a great point. That's a great point. I just maybe open up to everyone here. Have you seen anything either within your own provider or elsewhere where you're like, this was a great way to deliver an estimate, or this was a great method for communicating effectively or getting other providers on board? I was just curious if anyone's seen a best practice here.
So I I think it was Jefferson a while ago, used to have, and I don't know if they still do, but they used to have like the human body in shape, and someone could go click on it, right, online, and then it would give them an estimate of what that might look like. I'm sure it's changed, but I always thought that was cool because to a consumer, that's the easiest way to understand what's about to happen to me, right?
Yeah. Great. Love it. John, anything you wanted to add with respect to other pain points outside of the estimates that you're seeing, or frankly, a best practice in that area?
Yeah, I think that's one that I commonly hear, especially for those organizations who are relying more so on a manual creation of estimates. I think that process is a little bit easier for organizations who've invested in technology that can help at least get the estimate started or full-fledged produce an estimate, because everyone is challenged from a resource perspective. I've also hear a lot about the notices and disclosures and the patient protections under the No Surprise Billing Act. With some of the notices and disclosures in particular, there are some organizations who've taken a very conservative stance and are producing that at each and every patient encounter and interaction. And I know of others who have taken different approaches to that. So I think that's one that it's hard to operationalize to present it at each and every encounter. And it's kind of creating a little bit of a patient dissatisfier as well, because the patient doesn't understand in some of those instances, like, yeah, you gave me this already. I got it. I don't want it again. So to me, that's one of those interesting things that is a little gray and kind of up to each organization's interpretation. I would love to know, though, talking about the estimates again, has anyone been through a dispute resolution kind of process based on a good faith estimate being provided that wasn't accurate or fell outside of the acceptable threshold?
Not yet.
Yeah, I haven't had.
A lot have revoked it, right? They think it may be one, that's but not yet.
And actually, that ties to another question we got from the audience, John. So thank you for teeing that up. The question was, who's eating the cost of the difference of what used to be balance bill to patients? Is it mostly providers? Now, my understanding, and I'll throw myself out here first and then defer to the experts, is that the legislation submits that only for self-pay patients, if the estimate is off by $800 or more, is the provider on the hook. And then outside of that, I don't think there was anything clearly defined, but let me see if others have more insight.
I'll start. That's really our working understanding, right? If we get a dispute and it goes through that whole external process, and then the difference is something we will have to account for. I think right now, with everybody trying to figure out what this looks like, and is it an internal process or external, right? How that flows, but it's certainly for self-pay families who get an estimate. The providers are on the hook for that portion.
Yeah, and I was trying to read the question as well, and I'm maybe thinking it might go a different way when she's saying who's eating the cost for the difference, what used to be balance billed. I feel like maybe she's gearing at the out of network when you're coming through the emergency room as well. And your payer really should be processing that as if they were in network. So we can say that we feel that the payer should be on the hook for paying in network. From our standpoint here at Nebraska Medicine, we did create a work queue to capture some of those that are not paid at what would be the in-network rate. But I mean, it kind of comes down to then, where we used to balance bill these patients, did they historically go to bad debt? Could they be classified as charity? And so some of that still, I feel, does fall to the provider as well.
Yeah, we are doing a similar process, right? We're watching, seeing what it is, and then making determining what next.
I believe the threshold was 400, though, rather than
it's like
right? Yeah.
Good. That's even more painful. Okay. And then there was another question here in the chat on I missed whether or not this applies to patients who are seen with insurance that is out of network. Are we required to also provide a charge before services are rendered, or is this just emergency? And I don't think yet, right?
So I think, maybe I'll just, a good faith estimate is required for self-pay patients. Self-pay is non-insured and insured, but services that are non-covered. So there's so it is not exclusively emergency room services. It's and so I think certainly for emergency room, there's that process, which we call it the billing and claims workflow, right? You can only bill so much, and for certain providers, can you bill if you're out of network? But for all other patients, all other services, we have a responsibility as providers to provide a good faith estimate should that family meet either don't bill my insurance, self-pay, right? We have our 4 points we check, and those are the families who would get an estimate pre-service. So for procedures, surgeries, any of those can apply.
So we actually had to break out self-pay from uninsured because in New Jersey there's some different laws.
Yep. Yeah, we had to do all of those same nuances as well. Yeah.
Really I think that's one of the other pain points is knowing, what most of us know what our state laws are, right? But making sure they coordinate in with this too.
Totally. That's a very real pain point for a lot of folks. Awesome. Let's pivot, and maybe Sheila, you had already mentioned this, but I know one question we wanted to ask you is kind of how this legislation has impacted your day-to-day operations. Was that kind of your reference earlier to working with your access teams, or was there something else you wanted to call out?
Yeah, so a couple of things I would call out. Historically, we were probably sending, and remember, like I shared earlier, we're sending this to all patients, things that are scheduled, not just self-pay, right. Insured as well. So we used to send out, we'll say 1,500 to maybe 3,000 when we were lucky estimates a month. Last month, when we turned this on fully and we were feeling more confident with some other things, we did send out 18,000 estimates last month, which is by default helping to promote our point of service collections with our access staff and trying to collect that upfront when we're doing pre-registration. So it has continued to help in some of the day-to-day operations, as we all want to collect more upfront versus on the back and reduce statement postage and printing cost and hopefully reduce any bad debt as well. Again, we still have the pain points of estimates and them not being correct. And it's simply things that we have to change within our system.
Makes sense. And then I'm going to actually turn to another question because I'm keeping my eye on the clock. We don't have too much time and there's more Q&A coming through. But John, I couldn't help but get to this one. In your LinkedIn bio, you describe yourself as a revenue cycle geek, which is awesome, by the way. What advice, so given that you are such a geek here, what advice do you give to hospitals and physicians as navigating this new mandate?
Yeah, I think it's still regularly and routinely meeting as a cross-functional team within your organization. As we continue to move along the continuum, there are certain things that are becoming more clear and clarifications that are being published. There are a lot of professional organizations or CMS that are clarifying and publishing. So it's important to keep your ear to the ground on that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I think, just kind of the geek thing comes from, I love revenue cycle technology and being able to leverage technological solutions to make these processes more efficient. As mentioned, with tools that are out there that can help facilitate the creation of estimates and reduce the reliability on manual labor, which is tough to come by right now, and then oftentimes is error prone as well. So I think those would be my biggest recommendations at the moment.
That's great. And then Christine, one question we wanted to ask you is, at AtlantiCare, you have upgraded your virtual front door to help consumers connect with providers and resources. How do you view self-service options as a means of bolstering or enhancing the legislation requirements? And operationally, how does this all affect the administration? Oh, you're on mute, I think.
I'm so sorry.
No
so,
problem.
We've been really busy building this frictionless experience for our patients. We're on Cerner. We don't have the benefit of Epic, that all-in-one solution, so we have to find some of those vendors outside of there. So we have a couple of things. I'll give you examples. Right now, we have a product that does this touchless registration. And so our next component of that we're working on right now is that when folks come into our physician practices, that they're able to run an immediate insurance eligibility and pay some of those bills right during that registration process. So trying to create those seamless and frictionless experiences so that the patient's getting that information up front. And then when we build those things, we look to see, how do we spread that into other areas of our healthcare system to create those same similar experiences. So working through that with some of our vendors, and then, we use provider searches and self-service scheduling, and where are there opportunities within that to create those good faith estimates as people are looking at particular providers or, appointment purposes, and around some of the services, and how do we use our AI chat functionality to kind of start to pull together those experiences, so when the patient's looking and searching, they can go a step further and kind of see what it's going to cost them that day.
Yeah. And that chat functionality will be very much in line with that Amazon experience we were talking about before.
Correct. Yep.
That's right. Zakiya, CHOP obviously is unique in that you're often talking to families of the patient. And I'm curious, what is unique about supporting their needs and, managing those requirements, with respect to this legislation?
I think in the dynamic of talking about the care and cost and children, right, there's that it's very sensitive, and certainly the complexity of health plans is still the forefront of the conversation, right? How do you explain that, well, this part of what you need done isn't covered, thus you're getting this estimate for it, and really trying to explain that we're going to show up and do everything we should do for your patient and for your child, and we need to communicate to you what to anticipate. And so it's really framing potential and anticipated cost, because we were really trying to make sure it doesn't impinge upon access to services or scare families, because that is really part and parcel with being as transparent as possible can result in, well, maybe not, or I don't want that part, right? You don't want care to become a la carte when it's a comprehensive care model. So it's really trying to finesse that. Right? Team-based models and parts are not always covered, really create some, you do a lot of explaining of care model, care teams, and how the estimate aligns with that so that families will keep all parts of the care. So that's really the dance we're usually in terms of making this go along smoothly.
Yeah, it's consistent with what Christina was saying a little earlier, right? When you have a bunch of contracted docs who may or may not be covered under the plans that the member is part of, it becomes really difficult to kind of create that united front, that care team model, and put that information up front, because you can only do so much to manage all the disparate pieces behind it, right? That's helpful. I know we are getting close on time, so I want to make sure we answer a couple other questions that came through. There was one, and I'll open this up to whoever wants to take this one. An anesthesiologist at an in-network hospital has to be processed in-network according to ERISA. Is that correct? And the NSA would not supersede that, was the other part of that question. I want to take that.
I'm going to do the thing my team would say: connect with your legal compliance team, because they are your teammates in this whole space. There are a lot. Christine did mention it. New Jersey, they have there's a lot of nuance, and every practice has different rules, and how this overlays with that is really what makes this very complex. So I will say maybe. So it's really definitely confirm and double check that that's part of this. That's complex.
It's a very prudent answer. Oh, go ahead, Christine.
No, I was gonna just back that up. ERISA, from my knowledge, working as a benefits director for 15 years, was more about the tax liabilities and how to set up those defined plans. So I'm curious of, where that's falling in there around that particular piece. But I would definitely connect with legal as well.
Makes sense. Now, a number of you have talked about the operational challenges in building, and I think there's been lots of reference to, well, the team has done X or Y. I think there was a very specific question about that from one of our audience members. Did you have to build a team just for the legislation and the building of the estimates?
I can start with that. I would say we had a team already from our standpoint that were working on estimates initially. And so we did stick with that team. However, we did have to add in additional people. So for instance, with the different forms that a patient may get when registering, we wanted that to trigger when certain plan codes were registered. And so we needed to bring in more of our ADT people. And previously with working on estimates, we really didn't have them in that. So I would say we already had a team, but we had to expand it.
I would echo that. We bolstered and built up the team and or the scope of who is supporting this work. More of the team in financial counseling really started to do this more and more. So.
Okay. Well, with the couple minutes we have remaining, and if there are some final questions, please surface them, and we'll do our best to address. But maybe on a more positive note, what impact do you anticipate the No Surprises Act to have over the next few years? Like, where are we headed that we haven't yet, kind of dealt with directly? Who wants to start there? John, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I don't know that it's more positive, but I think there's a lot of anxiety around convening provider and obligations around that are forthcoming, that I know are a lot of folks that I talk to in operations and in the industry are kind of still struggling with wrapping their heads around how to operationalize that component, particularly when you're going to have some level of responsibility to collect information from other ancillary providers participating in the care event when you're deemed the convening provider. So interesting.
I agree. But I look at that more positive. I spent a lot of time in the pop health realm and looking at that. And you think about where healthcare has been going and trying to get all of these different and unique folks to kind of come together, share information, and communicate. I think one of the positives might be that, this is another push in that direction to really share information. We've seen a lot of legislation changes trying to go in that direction. But just like COVID had a lot of negatives, the positive there is it took us all from digital 0.0 to digital 10.0. So I think laws like this will help us continue to move some of that work forward. And then I think some of the things just to keep an eye on is, some of these providers, this law may have inadvertently, possibly given insurance companies an upper hand in negotiations with those independent providers. So I'll be curious to see if some of these providers start to kind of form little cohorts to try and negotiate more buying power, or can the hospitals work with those providers to create those avenues for more buying power? So, just something to look at and think about as we move forward.
That has come up a lot in my conversation as well. I think that's a really important point. And again, one of the challenges of when you start messing with the equilibrium here, there's ripple effects in different places, right? Unanticipated. Any final kind of sentiments or comments people want to make? I think we're going to need to wrap, but any other future forward-looking projections? Crystal balls?
If we had a crystal ball, that would be great, and we'd know what more is coming. I do think, if we wanted to have a positive outlook on this, there's a lot of positive. There's still some unknown, and I think once the payers get a little more involved with this, that'll be even more interesting. And we probably could have a whole nother discussion on that when that happens.
We certainly could. And I would say that's the one that I've certainly been watching, is to see what happens with the advanced EOB legislation and the impact both for the payer and the provider.
I would agree. The payer balance will help, right? There will be fewer carve-outs. Benefits may become a bit less challenging and complex to decipher the more that payers have skin in the game as well. So we'll see.
Well, we are at time, and I want to, first of all, thank you to the panelists for doing an amazing job with this webinar. I certainly learned a ton. Thank you for answering questions on the fly, some very general questions, some very specific questions. You guys were great sports. Learned a ton from you. And thank you to the audience for dialing in and joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks.
Take care.